Carter, thank you so much for joining me from sunny. Is it sunny in Hawaii at the moment? I can't tell from the window.
It's actually a little bit overcast here on the island of Oahu, but the sun will be back any minute now.
Yeah, I bet. So what time of is it? So it's here. We're coming into summer. Is there such thing as a winter in Hawaii?
Oh, there absolutely is. One of the best reasons to be on this island if you like the surf. We have surfers that come all over the world here to Oahu because on the North Shore you have some very famous breaks like Pipeline and Waimea and Sunset Beach, and so a lot of your neighbors there in Australia come over here and can beat. So it's a great place during the winter.
Yeah, nice, nice. Well, I'll have to check it out at some point. It's definitely somewhere I want to be. But today we're not talking about Hawaii. We're talking about yourself and your journey, and you've got quite an interesting one. So we've got a lot to discuss. You have been in the Salesforce ecosystem for more than or longer than most. You're one of the I guess the first trailblazers in the ecosystem way back when. So what did first attract you to Salesforce? At the point you joined when you I guess in terms of years, we were not long into the Salesforce journey itself.
Yeah, it was a pretty easy attraction. I was just right out of college. There was at the time Salesforce had 100 employees, and so I was just excited to after I graduated from college to move to San Francisco and have a job and live with my friends. So the honest answer is, who would have known that Salesforce is the amazing company it is today? It was, I think, a lot of it was luck at that time. So a good friend of mine who was at Salesforce said that I should come in and interview. And again, I had no idea what Salesforce did, and there wasn't any other bigger thing that I can share than it was just luck to join at the time when I did.
And I guess a bit of a risk at that point as well, because they were a startup. Like, were you being advised and guided by other people to go with bigger tech companies, or was joining a startup as cool as it is these days?
Yeah, there was definitely a number of people in the family that said I should go work for a bigger company like a Cisco or an Oracle, or Gallo Wines was fairly well known historically for great programs for up and coming people into the corporate world. And so, again, for me, I was just excited to get a job. And I went in, and when I interviewed with Salesforce, I really enjoyed meeting the people that I met there, including my first boss, Rob Acker, and felt like a good and fun team and culture. And again, I was just excited to have an opportunity to get in the workforce. But there was plenty of people who were saying I shouldn't go join a startup, and all the scary things that were happening with .com. Unfortunately, at the time, Salesforce was put in that same bucket. But I realized, after being there for quite some time, that I was pretty sure we are a little bit better than that.
Do you ever go back to the people that told you not to do it and give them a little nudge and say kind of worked out?
Well, one of them was my mom, who's actually one of my top advisors, always has been in my life. And so now, and early on, my mom was such a fan. So we joke about it from time to time for sure.
So you went in as a salesperson, right? So you were selling. Am I right in saying you were selling licenses from kind of get go?
Yeah, so when I started at Salesforce, there was very few teams or divisions within the sales organization. There was really just an inside sales team, which would be in the market potentially known as an SDR team. So that was really our team when I joined Salesforce, where we were answering the 1-800 no software line, and we were qualifying leads that were coming in. And then as we qualified those leads, we were passing them out to the sales team. And the sales team really consisted of, if you had a certain geography as an account executive, i.e., if you had California or New York, you had everything in that state. So there was no segmentation in there. But it was pretty funny. I mean, it was a pretty wild time because it was certainly at a point in .com and cloud that companies didn't want to put their data in the cloud. So we were out there writing scripts and getting rejected left and right by companies that didn't want to put their data in the cloud. But yeah, I started initially answering the 1-800 no software line at Salesforce.
Wow. And then obviously we now see this huge business. I think the revenue has just kind of overtaken SAP. So it's truly like an enterprise platform now, right? At what point in that journey for you did you start seeing Salesforce become an enterprise ready platform in terms of what the kind of customers that were adopting?
Yeah, great question. There was early on, there were some of the companies that many people in the market been familiar with companies like Act and Goldmine, who are known as the lower CRM companies, and then Siebel was always the big, monster out there, and one of the godfathers of CRM. Very early on, we could and really weren't competing with Siebel and some of the bigger companies and firms like the Oracles, but we were competing against some of the smaller CRM companies and winning. And it didn't happen until a few years into Salesforce in the journey that it was really more what Salesforce has referred to over the years as seed and grow. And that was a very successful strategy where early on Salesforce started getting into divisions of Aon and Honeywell. And really what happened is that the business leaders could bring in Salesforce because you didn't need IT to set up the servers, the hardware. In the business, all you really need was access to the internet to be able to take advantage of the great CRM software by Salesforce. So it was an interesting, I think, journey and path. Out of the gates, it was a lot of SMB and mid-market companies. But once we started to get into enterprise companies, that seed and grow started happening pretty quickly. Again, across some companies like Honeywell and Aon, and then propelling forward. Obviously, I think Salesforce really was the key reason why it ultimately ended to the demise of Siebel.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we hear stories of people buying Salesforce on credit cards, and obviously that doesn't happen these days in terms of the scale and I guess the cost. But that sounds like it truly was happening back then.
I think you can still actually pay for a credit card. In fact, I think with Thunder, we're a Salesforce customer ourselves. I think we actually are still paying by credit card. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think the opportunity again for a business leader to take out their credit card and transact was just making it easier from a procurement perspective, from that buying cycle for us to get organizations on, and also a key area that we relied on in the early days were the trials. We had 30-day trials with Salesforce, so anybody could sign up and go get a trial with Salesforce. And then when it became time to buy, we also early on had a model where the first 10 users were free for at least the first year. So that was also very attractive to smaller companies or smaller sales teams where you could get this great technology for free or for a very low cost.
Yeah, nice. So do you think, obviously you've gone on to run businesses, and do you think Salesforce attracted entrepreneurs, or do you think a lot of people became entrepreneurs working in that environment?
It's a great question. I haven't thought too much about the first part of that, so I'm not as in tune to some of the history of all the people that were there either before me. But I would say that Mark and the executive team, they hired pretty senior. They had brought over, Mark had brought over a lot of people from Oracle. Over time, there were people from Siebel that came over. So I think it was a really nice divide of some very experienced senior leaders. For me, at such a young age, everyone seemed like they had all this great experience, and a lot of people really did. But I think over the years, one of the things that Mark did so well is he really brought the right people into the business across all the different roles, and it didn't mean that we didn't have turnover or perfect fit, but I think early on Mark really taught the importance of building an insanely good leadership and hiring the best. So it felt like more people coming into Salesforce came from more corporate background, at least in the first couple years that I was there.
But there's so many, and I'm sure you know this more than anyone. But there's so many successful businesses that have been born out of Salesforce. You just think of like the App Exchange and a lot of the consulting companies that initially started off as Salesforce employees. And you're one of them, right? So you started Cloud Trigger off the back of leaving Salesforce and building a consulting business. What was the attraction to you of doing that? And for people that don't know that business, what was it known for?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, for me, it was interesting. I was on the up and up at Salesforce, and I had so many great mentors that took me under their wings for so many years. And being inside the four walls at Salesforce, I saw an opportunity to build a great consulting practice. So there was already a lot of great companies out in the market, and a number of people are familiar with a lot of those great firms like Blue Wolf and Aperio. And being inside the four walls at Salesforce, we were actually always frustrated that some of these partners couldn't go fast enough with us. So they couldn't write the SOWs fast enough, or they couldn't be responsive enough. And it was only because they were also growing really fast. So for me, I had an entrepreneurial spirit. I really wanted to do something with it, and so I started thinking about this gap that I saw in really how can we help organizations be more successful in adopting cloud technology. So I think that the business model of turning the lights on, allowing organizations to get all the benefits of cloud tech in that delivery model, but also how do customers engage and how do they buy and how do they adopt and how are they successful. So I was pretty sure that there was room for more partners in the ecosystem at that time, and so took the leap. And that's when it was a really hard decision, by the way, but I took the leap and left Salesforce after about 10 years and started my first company called CloudTrigger.
And at that point, were you servicing a particular like size of organization, or I guess that was probably before like specializing in an area of Salesforce. You kind of, I would imagine you did Salesforce, which wasn't as huge as it is today.
We right out of the gate started working with actually some very large media companies. So when my last role at Salesforce, I was in the media and telco vertical on the enterprise team, and so some of my clients that I was working with was Google and Disney. When I left Salesforce, I was able to continue to have some of those relationships still, and therefore I brought over Disney and Google and some other large media companies pretty much out of the gate. So fairly quickly, we became known as a go-to partner for Salesforce and around media and telco. But we also did a lot across the different clouds. We did a lot of work with technology and other industries. So it was kind of interesting for us. Over time, we had both, I would say, a focus on both enterprise and commercial and multi-industry.
Was it difficult to make that transition from selling licenses and to then selling services? Like, did that? Because some people think that's a transition that people can't make, and it's different, right? But was it in your experience?
For me, being in the sales organization for 10 years, part of the areas that I believe I had a lot of success at Salesforce in that sales role was being really focused again, not only all the reasons why we were going to win a deal, but all the reasons why we might not win a deal. And you tend to look and think about engagements a little bit differently. And a core component of that, again, is the implementation and creating that roadmap for success with Salesforce. And so for me, over the years, I had worked very closely with our partners like Blue Wolf and Imperio, and also worked very closely with our internal professional services team at Salesforce. And I was quarterbacking those different strategies on the implementation side. I almost never let one of our internal professional services consultants at Salesforce or one of the partners go into any prospective meeting or a client meeting without me there to help work on that strategy. So in some ways, I felt comfortable in that transition that I had been in a similar kind of motion for many years before going over. I would say the biggest thing to me in the biggest transition was being a leader for the first time, right? Starting a company. And, there was a lot of other things that seemed really, big and scary at the time, like finance and operations and things on that side of the house that I didn't have much prior experience at Salesforce with.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And obviously now looking back, that journey must have been pretty crazy, but it ended with an acquisition. So what do you think made you an acquisition target way back then? And how did that your first journey experience of an acquisition feel?
Yeah, for us, we started growing really fast when we launched the company, and we went from about 0 to 120 employees in about 2 to 3 years. Salesforce Ventures invested in our first company, CloudTrigger, and pretty much at the time that we took the investment, maybe not surprising now looking back, but it was almost like some sort of a textbook play where a number of the GSIs came and were very interested in acquiring CloudTrigger. So we had conversations with PwC and Accenture and a number of different firms. We got really excited when we met the team at Cloud Sherpas about that vision and that path that they were on. But ultimately, for us, there was a lot of things that we did extremely well at that time. And today, I would say that in some ways the market is just as is competitive, but I think the gap between good to great SIs and partners in the space is fairly substantial. And now because of all the acquisitions and things that have happened in this space, is I know you follow this, and it's part of your business and part of the motion that you're helping the market move forward from a talent perspective. It's, I would say, in a lot of ways, I've never seen a bigger opportunity than I do see today with the market in around Salesforce. So it's really exciting for us, especially with the new company and pointing back in. We're excited about where we are today and where we're going.
Yeah, and obviously we'll get to the fact that you're now back in and running another business, because I think like a lot of people think one acquisition is enough, and you've achieved everything, and going through that experience, like when you have had a business acquired and then you then become part of a new organization, like what's that like mentally? Because your role must change, your responsibilities change. Like, is that a difficult transition to make?
I think it really depends on the acquiring company, the culture, and your role, right? So for me, through the acquisition into Cloud Sherpas, my role initially was to run the Western U.S. Salesforce practice, which was a large role. So I had basically everything from a P&L perspective, and that was exciting. But I also saw some new opportunities, and so I built a new commercial team within our Salesforce practice that hadn't existed. I helped continue to build out our Service Cloud practice. But importantly, we had such an incredible vision, incredible culture. We had an incredible leadership team, great investors, and really just like the team across the board was so good. And we had a very clear vision of where we're going. And quarter over quarter, year over year, we really executed on that. So all those elements really came together for us. And I think we did a really good job in acquiring companies and really taking the DNA from these different companies that we acquired to build the bigger Cloud Sherpas organization. And we were thoughtful. So we really looked at different companies and their tools and their methodologies and their process and their people. And we're thoughtful again of how we put them into one combined organization. And I think, unfortunately, too often we see acquisitions in the market, both on the product side and the services side, where a lot of these acquisitions are not successful because sometimes they're met with a brick wall. There's not a great execution play to bring these companies together under one umbrella and to be able to execute moving forward. So I learned a lot. I learned a ton through that acquisition that I still am excited about today to be able to carry forward and hopefully improve on that.
Isn't it crazy the amount of people that tend to leave a company after they've been acquired? Like it's, as a recruiter, it's quite often where you go to for you're looking for candidates. It's quite an obvious place to hunt when a company's just been acquired, because there often is a lot of fallout. Is that, in your experience, just because of the culture clash, or like you said, things not just aligning quite nicely?
Yeah, I think it depends, right, on the acquiring company. I speaking freely, small firms aren't everybody for everybody. Big firms aren't for everybody, right? And I think some people tend to gravitate towards the smaller companies and the culture and their ability to make an impact in smaller companies. And that can happen also in big companies too. But I think for a lot of people, going from a smaller company to a bigger company, there's differences, right? There's nuances, there's changes to their day to day, there's changes in their comp plans, there's change in so many different variables that I think it makes it hard. But I will say that I agree with you. It's very eye opening to me, and it's very disruptive in a bad way for the market when these acquisitions happen, and it destroys a lot of that DNA, because there's a lot that's built around when we had Cloud Trigger and Cloud Sherpas and Aperio and Blue Wolf, and there's a lot of special things that happen in these smaller companies, and our ability to be more nimble, to be more flexible sometimes, and ultimately those relationships that are developed over the years at Salesforce, and why Salesforce might like to work with the regional systems integrators and the GSIs. And a lot of times when these acquisitions happen, sometimes the focus and the change morphs into the acquiring company. And so sometimes those relationships that were built, sometimes the people who were owning those relationships don't own those relationships anymore. Sometimes those current customers that you have, you can no longer work with because of a difference of methodology, pricing. There's so many variables. So I actually think in a lot of ways, I've seen so many of these acquisitions that you have too in the day to day that unfortunately they don't turn out well for a high percentage of not only the employees, but I would say for the market, where these customers sometimes are forced, or they obviously have sometimes at most all time they can maybe contractually or otherwise get out of their agreements to go work with another company. But I think at the core I see sometimes more disruption when these initially happen, or 2 years down the line or 3 years down the line. Ultimately, I've seen a lot of these acquisitions be extremely successful too, but it's hard. And again, I think it's disruptive. You could argue disruptive in a good way. You can argue disruptive in a bad way for the market.
Definitely. And then after Accenture acquired Sherpas, what kept you busy after that? Because you had some other ventures outside and some other opportunities that you explored.
Yeah, it was interesting after the acquisition to Accenture. It was just an amazing ride. Being inside the four walls at Salesforce for 10 years. Now one of the largest software companies in the world, to building some of these more nimble companies like Cloud Trigger and Cloud Sherpas, and now Thunder. And then, ultimately ending up in one of the largest services companies in the world. I'd really seen a lot. I had learned so much, and I was actually excited to start this new venture that was totally outside of the Salesforce ecosystem, because I had convinced myself along that journey that there must be life outside of Salesforce. So I actually went out. I built an innovation network. Actually built it on Heroku. We were in the Salesforce incubator, so just as fast as I thought we were getting away, we came right back in, and we were doing some special projects for Salesforce. It was a great venture. We worked with a lot of big firms. We worked with a lot of universities. Unfortunately, that venture ended up not leading to the success that we were hoping to have. And it was painful. It was really painful. I actually had to shut down the company, which was so hard. We had a lot of great employees. We had, again, some customers. I had investors, and it was really, really hard. It was one of the first times in my life that I'd really faced, at some levels, failure, but in another path, I was excited to take one of my dreams and a passion forward to the market. I just don't know that there was the right product market fit for the product that we were building at the time, but we had some success, but just not enough success in that venture.
And when we've discussed previously, we've spoken about product market fit, and you then went to work at WeWork, which I think you described as a great product market fit.
Yep.
So what have you learned going back then into a bigger organization, and obviously as you've seen Salesforce grow, if the product market fit is right, what else is kind of fundamental to success?
Well, are you talking about fundamental to success in a company in
Yeah,
general,
like the
or?
growth of a company. So obviously Salesforce nailed the product market fit and have
Yep.
gone on to have huge success. WeWork nailed it, and maybe hasn't been as successful more recently as anticipated. Like, do you see that there's other key factors behind the success of a business that is more so than just the product?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, depending, and I have this conversation with quite a few people, because I have a lot of friends that are entrepreneurs and maybe business owners at different levels. So to me, I think success could be, you might have a great little business with two or three employees. you know. So I think if we're talking about in the realm of a Salesforce or a WeWork, or a company that can get very large, and it's got to be founded around a big market, right? A big total addressable market. As you mentioned, the key element of that is having a killer product. You have to have happy customers. You've got to have differentiation in the market, right? So I think clearly Salesforce and WeWork have had both of those, and it actually feels funny to me in some ways to be talking about WeWork in this conversation, because they've had a little bit of different, endings. Clearly, they're different companies. It was really eye-opening today to see that WeWork is filing to go public. So anyway, but yeah, I think those are, top level. Those are some of the elements of, I think, of what's important for creating a bigger opportunity for bigger companies, right?
Because then you've now obviously with Thunder is born. You're now running another business. So what excited you about doing that? And obviously you've got all of these lessons from these experiences in the past. So like, what's kind of giving you the drive to come back and do it all again with everything you've learned?
I think it's probably a component of that last part that you mentioned is what I've learned. I think we have an opportunity to build an amazing company, an amazing culture. The market wants it. The market needs it. There's still a gap. There's a room for 20 plus additional great thunders in the market. I think I might have mentioned it earlier in the conversation that I just see that gap between okay to great Salesforce consulting companies. That gap is pretty big, and I think uh, there's a lot of talent out there that's kind of stuck in places right now and wanting and waiting to see that next Salesforce SI. And I think there's some great ones still out there today in the market, that have gotten some more of that size and scale, that have that culture, that have the leadership, that have all of those attributes that I think people are looking for. I also think people are a little bit nervous, because they've been in this playbook before, and they, maybe they were at Cloud Sherpas or Aperio or Blue Wolf, and they've gone through some of these acquisitions, and sometimes the companies haven't always ended up being what they want to be, and some of those people have stayed in the GSI because they're scared to see a path, again, go to a place that they're not really sure that they're going to have something as good as a Blue Wolf or Aperio or Cloud Sherpas. So, and I'm only using those three companies as reference. There's so many other amazing, wonderful Salesforce SIs out there in the market too.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned those three because obviously they're I would imagine they're the ones that you were dealing with right back at the beginning, the Blue Wolves and the Imperios, and obviously today they've still had that impact on you to be mentioned and not even necessarily around anymore, right? They've been acquired themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think Aperio, if I'm thinking through the trajectory, Aperio was acquired by WePro. Then Cloud Sherpas was acquired by Accenture and Blue Wolf by IBM. And there was a ton of acquisitions, prior to those three happening in the space. But yeah, all three of those companies went through acquisitions to fairly larger companies.
When you're setting up a business as a and you know more than most about the acquisitions in this ecosystem, like I think many people watching this or listening to this will set up a consulting business to be acquired, or have the vision of that's what we want to achieve. But do you think the journey that you've been on and starting a new business now, it's more important just to build an environment that people want to work in and then see what comes in the future, like just to create an environment that is going to attract those kind of people that you want to attract more so than having an end goal like that?
I think everyone comes into it a little bit differently, so it'd be hard to speak at the greater masses of every time that I take a call from somebody who's either looking to start a Salesforce consulting practice or another company. I do believe that, again, going back to my comments earlier, there are some people who build great companies that might not get that big, and I have a ton of respect. I think there's a lot of important things that come to alignment around the founders, whether you have investors or you don't have investors, and the type of people and the culture that you're building, right? So I think it's honestly different. There are great companies out there that might not ever go through an acquisition, and maybe that's not their future vision. I might be not factual, but I hear things like that about Slalom, right? My understanding from what I hear, factual or not, is that Slalom is really a family-owned business. There is no desire for them to be acquired. Maybe they go public one day, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think there's really a right or wrong, path forward. I think hopefully, I do think there's a responsibility for these companies to build excellence in the market, because unfortunately, I think too many customers have been in a situation where they've had negative relationships, projects with SIs, and that's also really disruptive and hard for the customers, and hard for the partner back at Salesforce.
100%. Now, obviously, there's been a fair amount of time between the two businesses. So, how does it differ running a consulting business now to when you started Cloud Trigger?
I love that. That my honest answer is not a lot has changed. I would say that I feel smarter in some ways of as far as running the company and building the companies with just such an incredible team that we have here today. But I'll be honest, the the playbook, whether depending on who you talk to, I would say the go to market motion is very very similar when it was. when we started CloudTrigger. I do believe that was part of our differentiation back in 2009. A lot of that go to market is the same. I think there are some nuances that make it harder in the consulting business around more competition, more pressure on the margins, more pressure on the pricing. So I think back in 2009, it was a little bit easier for us to get higher margins in the business. But now with more of the offshore capabilities that have been brought to the market that didn't exist as much, it was there, but it's much more competitive. And so I think that competitive pressure makes it more challenging in how you build a successful SI at scale. And again, there's a lot of dependencies around what you want that scale to be.
What about talent, talent attraction? Is it the same as it was? There were fewer people in the market back then, but there was less competition in terms of other companies hiring. So, do you find it's harder to attract talent now and the right talent? I'm imagining it's more expensive.
It is. It's more expensive. And one of the things that I didn't recognize, and this is an eyes wide open that everyone should tune into, is that back in 2009, when we were hiring consultants, let's just use some easy math. Let's say that we were paying these consultants, 80,000, 100,000. So these were our Salesforce BAs out in the market. We were billing those Salesforce BAs out in the market at $185 an hour. Probably in early 2010, getting $225 an hour for those consultants. Today, those same people, if you, I'm sure, have hired or placed some of them, if you looked at their trajectory back into 2009 or in that realm, those same people back in 2009, fast forward today, are easily making double the salary, but we're still billing them out at the same rate. That's a problem. That's a challenge, right? And you get more of that competitive kind of threat to the market. So it's harder, I think, in that way, that depending on the type of consulting company that you're building, you have to find ways to optimize the talent, right? So optimizing the talent could mean that you're building offshore teams. It could mean that you have the right infrastructure to bring on more junior resources. And I think that's really hard for a lot of companies. And to be fair to the people that you're intaking in the business, do you have the right infrastructure to make them successful? Because you could be placing, a perfectly qualified individual into a company that they just don't have the right training, they don't have the right programs, and it's really hard for that individual to be successful. So I think there's a lot of, again, variables that go into that matching of the company, the culture. Are you placing them into a startup with not a lot of process, or into a much bigger company that does have a lot more training and programs and ways for employees to be successful out of the gates?
Yeah, I agree. I find that some people are really cost sensitive when they're looking to hire, and they make the wrong hiring decisions because they're trying to get someone under a certain budget, but then they're not considering the actual environment they're bringing them into. And my biggest gripe is setting people up to fail. And I've heard of consulting partners hiring like super junior people and putting them on a project on their own from kind of day one with no support. And I think that's just not good for anyone, right?
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I mean, I call it sink or swim. It's sometimes you bring people in and you basically put them on a project and on a direction, and then unfortunately, sometimes it's that person is seen as, hey, they weren't successful, but they might not understand your company's process. They might not understand your company's methodology, and that's a challenge for a fast growing or a small company like Thunder, where you're sometimes building that as you go, right? You're building the ship as it flies. I don't think I got that. Building the plane as it flies is
Yeah.
the analogy, right? But ultimately, I think that it's hard, right? And so I think companies, again, you can either hire very senior, which comes with a pressure on your margins, or you can go really junior. We actually made the decision at Thunder to hire really senior, so we really have been blessed to have an incredible group of people at a very, I would say, at a very senior level that have come in and are building the companies and building the infrastructure so we can, scale and kind of round out the talent at the end of the day.
Yeah, nice. I think if you go that way, then it's easier to hire the juniors later, right? Because you've got the foundations, you've got the support. It kind of makes everything easier. But the initial outlay is obviously a lot more. So that's why some people don't go down that route. But I've never run a consulting business, but to me that makes sense to go that path.
Yeah.
Um, So you've had a lot of success in the past, and you learned a lot about running consulting businesses, and then you start Thunder, and there's a pandemic, and we're in COVID, and so what have you had to do personally to adapt as a leader through this period?
So we started Thunder just about a year ago. So C19 had already hit the market. It was probably for us, selfishly, it was the best time to start a company. What it did is it totally leveled the playing field. In the consulting business, a lot of times it's very competitive from a geographical perspective. But since COVID pulled that ability for so many people to get together and meet in person, go into offices, do whiteboarding, it totally changed the landscape for us in the most positive way. One, we didn't have to get on planes. Two, just from a pure cost perspective, we didn't have to be competitive with an office and some of the other things that traditionally do attract talent. But I think for us, it's we're really excited about the opportunity right now. Things I think are starting to come back. I hope, like everybody, that they do. What we're seeing more in the market today is I'm actually flying to New York tomorrow to meet with some prospects and some customers, but not in the office. So it's still happening, I would say, outside of the office. So I'm hopeful it'll come back. I personally am getting a little bit tired of sitting behind the Zooms and the Google Meets all day. So in the last couple of weeks, I've been traveling a little bit more, and it's been good to get out there.
Yeah, fingers crossed. It's on the up. We're still in lockdown here in Australia, but I think it's 20 days or so, and then we get our Freedom Day. So fingers crossed. So final question, for whether you're giving this advice to your younger self before you started the first consulting business, or to someone that picks up the phone to you tomorrow and asks your kind of top tip around running a successful consulting business, or number one piece of advice to someone starting out now, what would that be?
I would say it's a whole combination of one, you've got to have the gut, you've got to have the grit, you've got to have the energy. But I think a lot of it comes with having a plan, right? So there's so many critical elements to building a successful company. I think you've got to create the right culture. I'm not a highly religious person, but I do think you have to create a religion. You got to make the machine fire every day. You have to bring the energy. You have to have customer obsession, which is so important in this business. You have to create clear goals for the company, so everybody knows what needs to be done and why and to what standard. You have to be able to take ownership. You have to be able to deliver results, and the ability to consistently exceed for your team, for your company. So early on, you have to be willing to do everything too, right? Because until you have a team, I think it's important that you internalize that you're probably the person doing most, unless you are able to go out and raise a bunch of venture capital. But I think you also have to have that playbook where you insist on high standards, because the market is competitive. Our brand is everything in the market, and our customers, they insist on us having high standards. So I think it's just the motivation, the ability to bring the energy, and to somehow along the way have a lot of empathy and respect around the team, because it's hard, right? It's really, really hard. It is really hard to scale, but I was able to do it. We're doing it again, and I definitely always encourage a lot of people. I end up taking quite a few calls from different people who reach out and they say, "Hey, I would love to get some advice." And so I think I highlighted some of them, but I think as much as one looks at all the pros, I think people also have to be prepared that if it doesn't work out, where does that put you, right, in your personal kind of place as you move forward? Which I'm a huge believer that you should try things, and if they don't work out, it's okay, because a lot of us know where we can hopefully go back to. Whether it was, hey, you were doing recruiting for a bigger firm, or Ben, I think in our first conversation, I snapped back and said, well, I want to hire you to run talent at Thunder. So, I think for any of us who have developed a strong craft, I do think that's an important element of it, right? If you're really strong at one, component and understanding what your superpower is, play to that and build your team around that, again, depending on, how big you want to be. But there's also a lot of great, individuals out there now that are doing really well from an individual consulting level, right? That they are their own company, they are their own business, they are their own, uh, team, if you will. But I think there's a lot of opportunity for, like I said, so many more great services companies to be built in this space.
Yeah, awesome. And I'm really excited to see from afar Thunder, because I've seen some of the people you've got, and like the way that people talk passionately about the brand on LinkedIn, employees, and it just does seem like a great place to work. So yeah, I'm keen to see how things go. I'm sure in a year's time, yeah, the business will be huge.
Yeah, well, we're just excited to grow. Hopefully, smart. We've got a lot of opportunity in the market, and I hope you and I can stay in touch